Racist officer arrests black woman at gas station, not realizing she's the governor's wife. The gas station was unusually quiet that evening, with only the hum of an ice machine and the occasional rumble of a passing truck breaking the silence. Officer Craig Withers, his badge gleaming under the station's fluorescent lights, stood tall near his cruiser, sipping on coffee and keeping a watchful eye. It was his routine spot for monitoring the outskirts of town. But tonight was different. Tonight would be the beginning of a storm he never saw coming. Inside her sleek black SUV, Monica Turner adjusted her sunglasses and checked her phone. Her husband had texted her, "Running late for dinner? Let's wait until 7:30. Love you." Monica smiled, a warmth in her chest as she placed the phone in her bag and stepped out of the car to refuel. She had just swiped her credit card at the pump when a sharp voice interrupted her peaceful moment. "Hey, step away from the pump, ma'am." Startled, Monica turned to see Officer Withers marching toward her, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. His expression was cold, his posture rigid. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "I don't know what you're doing driving a car like that," he sneered, glancing at her SUV. "Let me see your ID." Monica blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me? I'm just getting gas." "You look suspicious," Withers said, stepping closer. His voice dripped with authority, and his hand now hovered uncomfortably close to his gun. "License and registration, now?" She hesitated for a moment, confused by the sudden hostility. "I'll get my license from my purse, but this is unnecessary," she replied, maintaining her composure. "Move any slower, and I'll cuff you for resisting an officer," he barked, his words sharp enough to cut through the still air. The moment she reached into her car to retrieve her wallet, Withers made his move. In a flurry of chaos, he yanked her arm back, forcing her against the vehicle. "You're under arrest for suspicion of car theft," he declared, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal felt cold against Monica's wrists as she protested. "This is a mistake. I'm not a criminal." "You can explain that downtown," Withers spat, shoving her toward the back of his cruiser. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, murmuring in shock as they recorded the unfolding scene on their phones. As Withers slammed the cruiser door shut, he failed to notice the murmurs grow louder. A young man in the crowd stepped forward, holding up his phone. "You're making a huge mistake, officer," he said loudly. "Do you even know who she is?" Withers scoffed. "I don't care who she is." The man smirked grimly. "You should. That's Monica Turner, the governor's wife." The blood drained from Withers' face. He glanced back at Monica, now seated in the back of his car, her eyes burning with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Earlier that day, Monica Turner had started her morning like any other, coffee in hand, scrolling through her emails in her sunlit kitchen. As the First Lady of Georgia, her schedule was always packed, but she enjoyed the moments of calm before her duties took over. Her husband, Governor Richard Turner, had kissed her on the cheek as he left for a series of meetings in Atlanta. "Don't forget our dinner tonight," he'd reminded her. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied with a smile. By mid-afternoon, Monica decided to take a detour on her way to their lake house. She loved driving by herself, something she rarely got to do without security detail. Today, she wanted to feel normal, just a woman running errands. Stopping at a small-town boutique, she browsed through racks of handcrafted jewelry, chatting briefly with the friendly shopkeeper. Monica was careful not to draw attention to herself. She had always been good at blending in, even with her high-profile status. Her next stop was the gas station. She planned to refuel quickly and be back on the road in no time. But fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to her, Officer Withers had been itching for action that day. Known for his overly aggressive policing, especially toward minorities, he had faced complaints before, though none had ever stuck. To him, Monica was just another target. A black woman in an expensive car, a combination he assumed meant trouble. As Monica filled her tank, Withers watched her from across the lot. He convinced himself she didn't belong there, that she must have stolen the vehicle. Fueled by his prejudice, he approached her with the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. What began as an accusation quickly escalated, Withers' hostility overshadowing reason. He ignored Monica's calm explanations and the growing unease of the bystanders. His mind was made up, but as he placed her in the back of his cruiser, the crowd grew restless. Phones captured every moment, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Then came the revelation, a voice from the crowd exposing Monica's identity. Inside the cruiser, Monica took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had done nothing wrong, and she would make sure this officer learned that lesson the hard way. The weight of the crowd's words hung heavy in the air. Withers felt the ground beneath him shift as he realized his mistake, but it was too late to undo what he had done. Then a call came through his radio. All units, be advised, the governor's office is searching for a vehicle registered to Monica Turner. Do not engage unless authorized. Withers froze, his heart pounding as the words echoed in his ears. Inside the cramped back seat of the police cruiser, Monica Turner stared out of the window, her jaw clenched. The murmurs of the crowd outside grew louder, their faces pressed against the glass of their phones as they captured every humiliating second. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with the simmering rage of being wrongly accused and treated like a criminal. Officer Withers, on the other hand, was panicking. His hand hovered over the radio as if he could erase the words that had just come through. Be advised, the governor's office is searching for a vehicle registered to Monica Turner. He turned to the young man who had spoken up earlier. Stay out of this. You don't know what you're talking about. The young man folded his arms, his smirk widening. I'm pretty sure I do, officer. And so do about 50 people live streaming this right now. Withers' eyes darted to the crowd. His breathing quickened as he realized the weight of what he had done. His face burned under the scrutiny of the lenses pointed his way. He turned back to Monica, who remained calm, though her eyes told a different story, a promise of reckoning. He pulled out his phone and opened his police database app, quickly searching her name. The results popped up instantly, complete with her photo. It hit him like a punch to the gut. Monica Turner wasn't just anyone. She was the wife of the most powerful man in the state. Still, Withers tried to rationalize. Maybe I can fix this. He opened the cruiser door and leaned in. Look, he began, his voice low. I might have acted a little fast here. Why don't we? Monica cut him off sharply. You're going to let me out of this car now. And then you're going to apologize in front of everyone. Her tone left no room for negotiation. But Withers wasn't ready to let go of his authority. Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. If there's been a misunderstanding, we can clear it up at the station. Monica tilted her head, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. Do you have any idea what you've done? Before Withers could respond, the crackle of his radio broke the tension. Officer Withers, what's your status? Over. He fumbled to grab it, nearly dropping the device. This is Withers. I've detained a suspect at the Shell station off Route 18, 10-4. Be advised, you may have a high-profile individual in custody. Confirm identity immediately. The dispatcher's tone was sharp, almost accusing. Withers hesitated, his hand gripping the radio tightly. I'm handling it, he replied, but his voice cracked slightly. The dispatcher didn't miss a beat. Governor Turner's office has been notified. Expect contact shortly. Withers' stomach dropped. He could already feel the weight of the governor's fury pressing down on him. He turned back to Monica, his confidence crumbling. Ma'am, Mrs. Turner, if you'll allow me to. You've already said enough, Monica snapped, cutting him off. She looked toward the growing crowd. Now, are you going to do the right thing? Or do I have to make this worse for you? The tension was electric. Withers knew there was no escape, but his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat just yet. He pulled out his phone and called his superior, stepping away from the car to avoid the crowd hearing. Chief, he muttered into the phone, his voice barely above a whisper. I've got a situation here. A misunderstanding with the governor's wife. The explosion on the other end of the line was immediate. What the hell have you done, Withers? You better fix this right now before it turns into a statewide scandal. Withers hung up, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened the cruiser door again, his hands trembling. Ma'am, I'm releasing you. I apologize for the inconvenience. Monica stared at him, her face a mask of icy calm. You're apologizing to the wrong person. Let the crowd hear it. Withers hesitated, then nodded. He stepped out and faced the onlookers. Folks, there's been a misunderstanding here. Mrs. Turner is free to go." The crowd didn't seem satisfied. Someone yelled, "Say you're sorry." Withers cleared his throat, swallowing his pride like a bitter pill. "I apologize, Mrs. Turner. I made a mistake." Monica stepped out of the cruiser, her composure unshaken. She turned to the crowd, her voice steady and powerful. "Thank you for standing up for me. This is what accountability looks like." The crowd cheered, but Monica wasn't finished. She pointed a finger at Withers. "This isn't over." Before he could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled into the station, its windows tinted. The door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, Governor Richard Turner himself. The crowd gasped, their phones now trained on the governor. His face was a storm of controlled anger as he marched toward Withers. "What the hell is going on here?" the governor demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Withers stammered, "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't know who my wife was?" Turner interrupted, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Or you didn't care? Because either way, you've made a colossal mistake." Monica stepped beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm. "Let him dig his hole, Richard," she said softly, though her words carried the weight of her fury. The crowd waited in breathless anticipation as the governor glared at Withers, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "You'll be hearing from my office," Turner said finally. "And if you have any sense left, you'll start updating your resume." As Withers nodded weakly, the governor turned to his wife. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she replied. "But this isn't just about me. He's done this before, I can tell." The governor nodded grimly. "Then we'll make sure it's the last time." The couple got into their car, the tension in the air thick as they drove off. But the story was far from over. In the shadows, someone from the crowd approached a man in a dark hoodie, whispering, "You get everything?" The man nodded, holding up his phone. "Every second." The whisperer smirked. "Good. This is about to go viral." The video hit the internet before the governor's SUV had even reached the highway. Uploaded to every major social media platform, it spread like wildfire. The title was damning. "Racist Cop Arrests Governor's Wife in Broad Daylight." By the time Monica and Richard arrived at the governor's mansion, the video had already been viewed millions of times, with hashtags like #JusticeForMonica and #EndPoliceRacism trending nationwide. Monica sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone as the comments flooded in. She read a few aloud to Richard, who paced back and forth, his face grim. "This is why we need reform," she quoted. "If they can do this to her, imagine what they're doing to people without power." Richard stopped pacing and looked at her. "This is more than just about you, Monica. This video, this moment, can change things. We need to act." "I agree," she said, "but we need to be strategic. If we don't handle this the right way, it'll just be another scandal that fades in a week." Before they could continue, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "It's the chief of police. I better take this." He stepped into his office, leaving Monica alone with her thoughts. Her calm exterior masked the storm brewing inside her. She couldn't shake the memory of Withers' smug face, the way he had yanked her arm, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into her wrists. The humiliation was one thing, but the sheer injustice of it all was unbearable. Meanwhile, Officer Withers sat in his modest apartment, staring at his TV in horror as the news anchor replayed the video. The footage, which has now been viewed over 10 million times, shows Officer Craig Withers detaining Monica Turner, the wife of Georgia Governor Richard Turner, in what many are calling a clear case of racial profiling, the anchor said. Withers' phone buzzed on the coffee table, but he ignored it. He'd already received dozens of calls, most from reporters, some from his furious boss, and a few from people hurling insults and threats. His career was crumbling before his eyes, and he didn't know how to stop it. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. News trucks lined the street outside the governor's mansion, and activists began organizing protests in front of the police station where Withers worked. Monica watched from the window as a crowd of protesters marched down the street, their signs held high. One sign read, "Justice for Monica." Another said, Fire Withers now. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from her publicist. We need to release a statement. The world is watching. Monica sighed. She knew the public wanted her to speak out, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. She needed to gather her thoughts, to make sure her words carried weight. Monica, Richard said, stepping into the room. The chief of police wants to meet. He says they're launching an internal investigation into Withers. She raised an eyebrow. An investigation? That's their big response? He's on video, Richard. What more do they need? I know, Richard said, his voice tense, but they're trying to cover themselves. They don't want to admit fault until they have to. Then let's make them, Monica said, a fiery determination in her eyes. At the police station, Withers sat in a conference room with Chief Evans, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. This is a PR nightmare, Evans growled, slamming a stack of papers on the table. Do you have any idea what you've done? I was just doing my job, Withers muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Your job, Evans snapped, is to protect and serve, not to humiliate innocent people in front of a crowd of cameras. And now, because of you, the department's reputation is in the gutter. Withers remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Evans leaned in closer. You're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs is going to tear you apart, and frankly, you deserve it. But, Withers began. But nothing, Evans interrupted. You're done. Now, get out of my sight. Withers stood slowly, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. As he walked out of the station, he was met with a barrage of boos and jeers from the protesters outside. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, but he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Back at the mansion, Monica and Richard sat in their living room, surrounded by advisors and staff. This is the perfect opportunity to push for real reform, one advisor said. We can draft a bill that addresses racial profiling and police accountability. Agreed, Monica said. But I want this to be more than just a bill. I want this to be a movement. Richard nodded. Then we'll start with a press conference. Monica, are you ready to speak? She hesitated, then took a deep breath. Yes, let's do it. The next day, Monica stood on the steps of the state capitol, surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. Richard stood by her side, along with several civil rights leaders and activists. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened to me at that gas station was not an isolated incident. It was not an accident. It was the result of a system that has allowed racial profiling and abuse of power to go unchecked for far too long. The crowd murmured in agreement. But this is not just about me, she continued. This is about every person who has been targeted, humiliated, or harmed simply because of the color of their skin. This is about justice. This is about change. Her words ignited a wave of applause and cheers. But even as she spoke, Monica knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and there were still battles to be fought. And somewhere, in the shadows, Officer Withers watched the press conference on a grainy TV screen, a dark thought forming in his mind. Officer Withers sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. The flickering light from the TV cast shadows across his face as he watched Monica Turner's press conference replay for the third time. Her calm authority as she spoke to the nation only deepened the resentment building inside him. She made me look like a fool, he muttered, his voice slurred. He reached for the remote and turned up the volume. This is not just about me, Monica's voice echoed from the screen. This is about accountability, about dismantling a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. Withers clenched his jaw, gripping the armrest of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was no longer thinking about what he had done, only what he had lost. His badge, his paycheck, his reputation, all of it gone because of her, or so he convinced himself. And now, the entire nation was calling him the face of racism in law enforcement. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from an unknown number. Keep your head down. Not everyone thinks you're the bad guy. We're with you. Withers stared at the message, his mind racing. Who was we? And what did they mean by with you? He typed out a quick reply. Who was this? But received no response. A part of him felt unease creeping in, but another part, a darker, angrier part, felt emboldened. Across town, Monica sat at the dining room table, sipping tea as she reviewed drafts of the police reform bill she and Richard were preparing to introduce. The bill was ambitious, calling for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight of misconduct investigations, and strict consequences for officers found guilty of racial profiling. This is good, she said, handing the draft back to the legal advisor. But we need more public input. Let's hold town halls in the cities most affected by this. Richard nodded in agreement. We'll need to double the security detail for you if you're going to be out in public that often. Monica waved a hand dismissively. I'll be fine. I won't let fear stop me from doing what's right. Her confidence reassured Richard, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this fight was putting a target on her back. He decided to make a call to their head of security later that night, just to be safe. The first town hall was held at a packed community center in downtown Atlanta. The air buzzed with energy as hundreds of people gathered to share their stories and voice their concerns. Monica stood at the front of the room, listening intently as a young black man recounted his experience of being wrongfully detained by the police. I was just walking home from work, the man said, his voice trembling, and they threw me against the wall like I was some kind of criminal. No apology, no explanation, nothing. Monica nodded, her heart heavy. I'm so sorry that happened to you, she said. And I promise, we're going to fight to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. The crowd erupted in applause, but not everyone in the room shared their enthusiasm. In the back corner, a figure in a hoodie sat quietly, their eyes fixed on Monica. They were streaming the event live, their phone angled to capture every word she said. When the event ended, Monica shook hands with attendees, offering words of encouragement and support. The man in the hoodie slipped out unnoticed, blending into the night. Later that evening, Monica and Richard returned home, exhausted but energized by the overwhelming support they had received. Monica sat on the couch, kicking off her heels and scrolling through social media. Videos from the town hall were already trending, with hashtags like #MonicaForJustice and #TurnerReformBill dominating the conversation. People are really responding to this, she said, showing Richard her phone. We're making a difference. He smiled, sitting beside her and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. I'm proud of you, he said, but I don't want you to overwork yourself. You've been running on adrenaline for days. I'll rest when this is done, she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. But rest would not come easily. In a nondescript room miles away, Officer Withers sat with two men he had never met before. They wore plain clothes and spoke in low voices, but their message was clear. You're not the only one who feels like you were hung out to dry, one of them said. This country's turning into a joke, pandering to people like her. Withers didn't respond immediately, but their words resonated with the bitterness in his heart. What do you want from me? He asked. We're not asking you to do anything illegal, the other man said with a sly grin. Just keep in touch. If you ever feel like speaking your truth, we'll make sure people hear it. Withers nodded slowly, the anger in his chest rekindled. I'll think about it. As the men left, one of them handed Withers a burner phone. Call us if you need anything. And remember, you're not alone in this. The next morning, Monica was reviewing her schedule when Richard walked in, holding a letter in his hand. His expression was grim. What's wrong? She asked, sensing the tension. This came in the mail, he said, handing her the envelope. Inside was a typed note. Stay in your lane, Mrs. Turner. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. Monica's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly steadied herself. Cowards, she muttered, crumpling the note and tossing it in the trash. They think they can scare me into silence. Richard placed a protective hand on her shoulder. We're increasing your security, effective immediately. I don't care if you think it's unnecessary. Fine, she said, reluctantly, but I'm not stopping. Whoever sent that note is going to regret it. Outside the mansion, a black SUV idled down the street, its windows tinted. Inside, the man in the hoodie watched through binoculars, a sinister smile on his face. The next morning, Monica woke up to an unsettling quiet in the mansion. Richard had already left for a meeting, leaving her to start her day in solitude. But something about the stillness gnawed at her. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from an unknown number. "We're watching. Back down before it's too late." Her hand tightened around the phone as a chill ran down her spine. Monica had dealt with threats before. They came with the territory of being in the public eye, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a coward hiding behind anonymity. It felt personal, calculated, as if whoever sent it was much closer than she realized. Instead of panicking, Monica forwarded the message to Richard and their head of security, along with a simple note. Another one. Handle it. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. Later that day, Monica attended the second town hall, held in a rural town notorious for its tension between the community and law enforcement. The room was packed, with locals spilling out into the hallway. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken grievances. Monica stood at the podium, her voice steady as she began. "Thank you all for coming today. I'm here to listen and to work with you to ensure justice is not just a promise but a reality." As she spoke, a man in the back of the room stood abruptly. His voice cut through the crowd. "Justice? You're here to lecture us about justice while you smear good cops?" The room fell silent, all eyes on the man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly angry. Monica didn't flinch. "Sir, I'm here to address systemic issues. No one is smearing good officers. We're calling out the bad ones who tarnish the badge." The man scoffed. "You're turning this country against law enforcement. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just making it worse for everyone." Before Monica could respond, several people in the crowd shouted him down. "She's speaking the truth," one woman yelled. "You're part of the problem." The tension threatened to boil over, but Monica raised her hand, calming the crowd. "Let's keep this civil," she said firmly. She turned back to the man. "I understand your frustration, but this isn't about turning people against law enforcement. It's about accountability. Wouldn't you want the same if you were in our shoes?" The man hesitated, his anger flickering. But before he could reply, a loud bang echoed through the room. Chaos erupted. People screamed and ducked for cover, some scrambling toward the exits. Monica's security team immediately surrounded her, shielding her as they moved her toward the back of the building. "Get her out of here," one of the agents barked. Monica's heart pounded as she was rushed into a waiting SUV. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Gunshot," the agent replied grimly. "We're not taking any chances." As the car sped away, Monica's mind raced. Had the shot been a warning? Or had it been meant for her? Either way, the message was clear. Someone wanted her silenced. Back at the mansion, Richard was waiting in the driveway when the SUV pulled in. He ran to the car as soon as it stopped, pulling Monica into a protective embrace. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. "I'm fine," she said, though her hands were trembling. But someone fired a shot during the town hall. Richard's face darkened. "That's it. We're escalating security and involving the FBI. This has gone too far." Monica nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let them come. I'm not backing down." Miles away, in a dimly lit bar, Officer Withers nursed a beer as he watched the evening news. The anchor recounted the incident at the town hall, showing shaky footage of the chaos. "Authorities have yet to identify the source of the gunshot," the anchor said, "but the First Lady was unharmed and has vowed to continue her fight for justice." Withers took a long sip of his drink, his jaw tightening. His phone buzzed on the table. It was the burner phone the mysterious men had given him. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A familiar voice came through the line. "We told you you're not alone in this. You saw the news?" "Yeah," Withers replied. "What's your point?" "Our point is, she's a threat to everything we stand for. And threats need to be neutralized." Withers frowned. "I didn't sign up for anything illegal." "Relax," the voice said. "We're just talking about applying a little more pressure. Make her second whether all this is worth it." Withers didn't respond, but the silence on the line spoke volumes. "Think about it," the voice said before hanging up. Withers stared at the phone, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Back at the mansion, Monica sat in her office, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She opened her laptop and began drafting a public statement, determined to address the growing danger head-on. But before she could finish, there was a knock at her door. Richard stepped in, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said, handing her his phone. On the screen was a grainy photo of her, taken at the town hall earlier that day. The caption was chilling. "Next time, we won't miss." Monica's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Who sent this?" "We don't know," Richard said, "but the FBI is already tracking it. They'll find whoever's behind this." Monica set the phone down and took a deep breath. "Let them try," she said, "because whoever they are, they just made a big mistake." Outside the mansion, the dark SUV idled once again. This time, the figure inside wasn't just watching, they were planning. The mansion was now a fortress. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and surveillance cameras monitored every angle. Monica hated the heightened security, but after the threats and the gunshot at the town hall, even she had to admit it was necessary. Still, the tension was suffocating. She spent her days strategizing with her team and her evenings trying to unwind with Richard, though the constant updates from law enforcement and the media kept them both on edge. One night, while the mansion was quiet, Monica sat in her study, poring over the latest draft of the reform bill. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she sighed, expecting another email or update. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "You were lucky this time. Back down before your luck runs out." Her pulse quickened, but her face remained stoic. She immediately forwarded the message to the FBI team handling her case. Within moments, her phone rang. It was Special Agent Leonard, the lead investigator. "Mrs. Turner," Leonard began, "we received your forwarded message. We're tracing the number now, but it's likely a burner phone. We'll keep you updated." "Thanks," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Any progress on the previous threats?" Leonard hesitated. "We've narrowed down the source of the letter, but it's taking time to gather concrete evidence. We're also looking into the crowd from the town hall. Someone there may have fired the shot." Monica sighed. "Keep me posted, Agent Leonard. And find these people before they escalate." "Yes, ma'am," he assured her. As she hung up, Monica leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She refused to let these threats intimidate her, but the unease gnawed at her. Whoever was behind this wasn't just targeting her. They were trying to dismantle everything she was fighting for. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Withers sat in the back of a dimly lit warehouse, his nerves frayed. He had agreed to meet the men who had been contacting him, but now he was beginning to question his decision. The two men from before sat across from him, their faces shadowed by the flickering light of a single bulb. "We need you to step up," one of them said, leaning forward. Withers frowned. "What do you mean? I've already lost my job because of this mess." The second man smirked. "Losing your badge doesn't mean you're powerless. You know people in the department, people who think like you. Use that." Withers shook his head. "I didn't agree to anything criminal." "This isn't criminal," the first man said smoothly. "This is about balance. About pushing back against the people trying to destroy what we stand for." Withers hesitated. He wasn't sure what pushing back meant, but the anger inside him was still raw. He felt betrayed by the system, by the public, and even by himself. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. The men exchanged a glance, their smiles dark and knowing. The next morning, Monica prepared for another town hall, this one in a larger city with higher stakes. The FBI had insisted on a comprehensive security plan, complete with plainclothes agents in the crowd and snipers positioned on nearby rooftops. Monica appreciated their diligence, but it also underscored just how dangerous the situation had become. As she arrived at the venue, the crowd was already massive, with supporters waving signs of encouragement. But there were also protesters, their voices cutting through the air like knives. "Go home, Monica," one man shouted. "You're ruining everything." Her security team kept a tight formation around her as she walked into the building. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. Dozens of cameras pointed at her as she stepped onto the stage, the room buzzing with anticipation. Monica took a deep breath and began her speech. "We are here to create change, to demand accountability, and to ensure justice for all. This is not about tearing down law enforcement. It's about building a system that works for everyone. The crowd erupted in applause, but Monica noticed a few faces that remained stony and unyielding. Among them was a man near the back, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him made her uneasy, but she pushed the thought aside and continued. As the event went on, audience members shared their stories. One woman spoke about losing her son to police brutality. A young man described being profiled and harassed repeatedly. Their voices were raw, filled with pain and a longing for change. But just as Monica began to respond to a question from the audience, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A group of men in matching shirts pushed their way into the room, holding signs that read, "Support our cops," and shouting slogans. The crowd turned to face the disruption, their cheers and applause replaced by angry shouts. "Keep it civil," Monica called out, her voice firm. But the tension in the room was palpable. Suddenly, one of the men threw a smoke canister onto the stage, filling the room with a thick, choking cloud. "Get her out of here," one of the security agents yelled, grabbing Monica's arm and guiding her off the stage. Panic spread like wildfire as people scrambled for the exits. Monica could barely see through the smoke, her heart pounding as she was rushed through a side door and into a waiting car. "What just happened?" she demanded as the car sped away. "Coordinated attack," the agent replied grimly. They knew what they were doing. Monica clenched her fists. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate her, they were escalating. And she knew this was far from over. As the smoke cleared in the town hall, a figure slipped out unnoticed, blending into the chaos. It was the man in the baseball cap. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's done," he said simply. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice replied. "Good. Let's see how she handles this." The attack at the town hall dominated the headlines. Images of Monica being rushed off stage through a cloud of smoke were plastered across every major news outlet. Social media exploded with outrage, both at the attackers and at the lack of security that allowed such an incident to occur. Monica sat in the governor's mansion, watching the news coverage while Richard paced the room, his phone glued to his ear as he coordinated with law enforcement and federal agencies. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her safety anymore. It was about the message these attacks were sending, that justice could be silenced through fear. "That's not going to happen," she muttered to herself, standing and turning off the TV. Richard ended his call and turned to her. "FBI says the attack was planned by an extremist group. They're working on identifying everyone involved." "Good," Monica replied, her tone sharp. "Because this wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on everyone who believes in justice." Richard walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We need to be smart about this. Whoever these people are, they're not playing games." "Neither am I," Monica said firmly. "I won't let them scare me into silence." Across town, Officer Withers sat in a seedy diner, his eyes darting nervously to the door every few seconds. He wasn't sure why he had agreed to meet the man who had called him after the town hall attack, but his curiosity and his bitterness had gotten the better of him. The man arrived exactly on time, sliding into the booth across from Withers. He was dressed in plain clothes, but his demeanor radiated confidence. He placed a burner phone on the table and leaned in. "You heard about the town hall," the man said, his voice low. Withers nodded. "Yeah. Look, I didn't sign up for." "For what?" the man interrupted. "For people like her to take everything away from you? For your entire life to be ruined while she plays the victim?" Withers frowned, his jaw tightening. "I didn't sign up for violence." The man smirked. "Violence? Is that what you think this is?" What happened at the town hall was a statement, a reminder that people like her don't get to rewrite the rules without pushback. Withers leaned back, uncomfortable. "What do you want from me?" "We want you to help us level the playing field," the man said. "You've got connections, knowledge. You can give us an edge." "I'm not doing anything illegal," Withers said firmly. "Relax," the man replied, his smirk widening. "You won't have to. Just think about it." He slid the burner phone across the table and stood to leave. "When you're ready to stop being a victim, give me a call." Withers stared at the phone, conflicted. The anger inside him burned hot, but a part of him knew he was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. That night, Monica sat at her desk, reviewing a draft of her next public statement. She knew she needed to address the attack, but she also didn't want to give her attackers the satisfaction of knowing they had rattled her. As she typed, her phone buzzed. It was a call from Agent Leonard. "Mrs. Turner," Leonard said, his voice tense. "We've identified one of the men involved in the town hall attack. He's part of a fringe group that's been linked to similar incidents across the country. Do you know who's leading them?" Monica asked. "We're working on that," Leonard replied. "But there's more. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're planning another attack. This time, something bigger." Monica's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know where?" "Not yet," Leonard admitted. "But we're monitoring their movements closely. In the meantime, I strongly advise you to cancel any public appearances." "That's not going to happen," Monica said, her voice steely. "If I back down now, they win." "Mrs. Turner, your safety is our priority," Leonard said firmly. "And justice is mine," Monica replied. "Keep me updated, Agent Leonard." She ended the call and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If they were planning something bigger, she needed to be ready. The next morning, Monica called a meeting with her team. Richard, her advisors, and her security detail gathered in the mansion's conference room, their faces grim. "We can't let these people intimidate us," Monica began. "But we also can't ignore the risks. We need to be proactive." One of her advisors nodded. "We should use this moment to rally more support. The public is on your side. They want to see action." "Agreed," Monica said. "But we also need to send a message to these extremists. They need to know we're not backing down." Richard frowned. "Monica, we need to be careful. These people are dangerous." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "But if we let fear control us, they've already won." Meanwhile, in a hidden meeting space, the man from the diner convened with his group. A map of the city was spread across the table, marked with red XS. "The next event is scheduled for Saturday," the man said. "She'll be there. We make our move then." One of the group members hesitated. "Are we sure about this? Security will be tight after what happened at the town hall." The man smirked. "Security won't matter. We've got a plan." As the group murmured in agreement, the man's phone buzzed. It was a message from Withers. "Let's talk." The man's smirk widened. "Looks like we've got a new ally." On Saturday, Monica arrived at the community rally, her security team on high alert. The crowd was larger than ever, with supporters waving signs of encouragement and cheering as she stepped onto the stage. But hidden among the crowd, the man from the extremist group watched her, his eyes cold and calculating. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text. "It's time." Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed through the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The explosion tore through the rally like a thunderclap. The crowd screamed in panic, scattering in all directions as a thick cloud of dust and smoke engulfed the stage. Monica froze for a split second, disoriented by the blinding flash and deafening sound. Then, instinct kicked in. "Get her out of here," one of her security agents shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a waiting vehicle. Monica stumbled, her heart racing, as the world around her descended into chaos. The shouts of the crowd, the blaring sirens, the distant sounds of breaking glass. All of it felt like an assault on her senses. As the security team hurried her into the SUV, she looked back toward the stage. The plume of smoke was still rising, but there was no sign of the attackers. No clear target. It was impossible to tell who had set off the explosion, or whether it had been aimed at her specifically. "Is everyone okay?" Monica asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Everyone's accounted for, ma'am," one of the agents replied, his voice grim. "We're heading back to the mansion now. Stay down." The vehicle sped away, tires screeching as it maneuvered through the streets. Monica could feel the weight of the moment sinking in. This was no longer just a threat. This was an attack on her life, and it wasn't over. Back at the mansion, the scene was frantic. Richard had already called for additional security, and agents from the FBI were flooding the area. Monica was ushered inside, but she couldn't escape the feeling of dread gnawing at her. She knew the explosion had been meant for her. She paced the hallway, her mind racing. The world seemed to be closing in, the walls of her own home no longer offering the safety they once did. She couldn't sit still. She couldn't let fear take over. She needed to act. The door to her study opened, and Richard entered, his face pale. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "I'm fine," she said, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she felt. "But this is getting worse. They won't stop until they get what they want." "Monica," Richard said, his tone soft but firm, "we need to let the authorities handle this. We're escalating this too quickly. Your safety." "I'm not backing down, Richard," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I won't give them that power." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "You can't keep putting yourself at risk like this. You're not just a symbol of change anymore. You're a target." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I know that, but I can't let them win. If I stop now, they've already succeeded." Meanwhile, far from the chaos at the rally, the man in the baseball cap stood in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, watching the unfolding events on his phone. His finger hovered over the screen, replaying the footage of the explosion over and over. The message had been sent, loud and clear. But there was more to be done. His phone buzzed again, and he answered without hesitation. "It's done," he said, his voice low. The voice on the other end responded immediately. "Good. Keep pushing. She won't stop. But we have a way of making sure she does." The man smirked, his eyes glinting with cold determination. "I'll be ready." Monica's next move was clear. She couldn't allow the attackers to dictate the terms. If they were going to escalate, so would she. It was time to take her fight to the next level. That night, she called for a press conference. She knew the media would be watching, and she would not let the explosion define her. She would not let it force her into hiding. The conference was scheduled for the following morning. The mansion was buzzing with activity as Monica's team prepared for the event. Richard stood by her side, his face lined with concern, but also an unspoken resolve. He knew this wasn't just about policy anymore. This was about survival. As Monica stepped in front of the cameras, the room fell silent. Her gaze swept over the crowd of reporters, each one eager for a headline, for an answer. She took a deep breath and spoke. "Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a person who is committed to the truth," she began, her voice strong. "I will not be intimidated. I will not be silenced. The attacks against me are not just an attack on one woman. They are an attack on the people I fight for. The people who deserve justice. The people who deserve to live without fear." Her words were met with a hushed silence. She could see the reporters scribbling down every word, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. "I know some of you are wondering if I'm scared. If the violence will make me change course," Monica continued. "I am not scared. I am resolute. I will not stop until we have the justice this country deserves." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And to those who think they can break me, know this: you will fail." Outside, the dark SUV idled once again, parked just a few blocks from the mansion. The man in the baseball cap watched the live broadcast, his eyes narrowed in thought. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, his voice low. "She's tougher than I thought. But that just means we need to raise the stakes." He tapped a message into his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Make sure she feels the pressure. It's time for the next step." As he hit send, a chill of anticipation swept over him. The game had changed, and so had the rules. Inside the mansion, Monica stood before the mirror in her office, watching her reflection as the press conference ended. She had said everything she needed to say, but there was no relief, only the knowledge that this was far from over. Whoever was behind these attacks had made a mistake. They had underestimated her, and they would pay for it. The door to her office opened quietly. Richard entered, his face tight with concern. "Monica, we need to talk about your safety." Before he could finish, the phone on her desk rang. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the caller ID. "FBI agent Leonard." "Mrs. Turner," Leonard said, his voice grave, "we need to act fast. We've traced the communication from the burner phone. We found the location. Monica's heart hammered in her chest. What location? Where they're meeting, Leonard replied. We have a chance to take them down before they strike again. She glanced at Richard, who was already nodding. We need to go now. As the team assembled and prepared to leave the mansion, Monica felt a familiar sense of resolve settle over her. This fight was far from over, but this time, she was going to take the fight to them. The tension in the mansion was palpable as Monica and her security team prepared for the operation. Richard stood beside her, his brow furrowed with concern. The plan was simple. They had a lead on the extremists who had been targeting her, and the FBI was ready to move. But there were no guarantees. It was a risky operation, and the stakes had never been higher. We've got one shot at this, Agent Leonard said, his face grim as he briefed the group. We're targeting a warehouse on the outskirts of town. We believe it's where they've been meeting and coordinating. If we're lucky, we'll catch them in the act. Monica nodded, her expression hardening. We don't have the luxury of being lucky. We need to end this today. Understood, Leonard replied. The team will move in quietly. We've got snipers in place if anything goes wrong. Richard placed a hand on Monica's shoulder. You don't have to do this. I know you're determined, but you're already a target. Let's leave this to the FBI. Monica turned to him, her eyes steely. This is my fight. I can't let them control the narrative anymore. I won't let them intimidate me. They've attacked my life, my reputation, my home, and I'm not going to stop until I make sure they never hurt anyone else. Richard sighed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the situation. He knew she was right, but every part of him wanted to keep her safe. Still, he knew he couldn't stop her. I'll be right here, Monica, he said softly. Just promise me you'll come back to me. She gave him a brief, reassuring smile. I will. The convoy of SUVs sped through the streets, the agents inside alert and ready. Monica sat in the back, her mind sharp and focused. The noise of the engines faded as she blocked out everything except the task at hand. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, every action she took from this point on could have a ripple effect far beyond her own life. As they neared the warehouse, the tension in the air grew thick. Monica's heart raced, but her hands were steady. She had to trust the FBI to handle this the right way. They had the location, they had the backup, and they had the element of surprise. This was her chance to end this nightmare once and for all. The convoy came to a stop a few hundred yards from the warehouse, and the team disembarked quietly. Monica was escorted by two of her most trusted agents, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The area around the warehouse was abandoned, silent, save for the faint hum of distant machinery. It looked almost too quiet, too empty. Stay close, one of the agents whispered, his voice low but urgent. We're going in. The team moved quickly, their footsteps barely making a sound as they approached the entrance. Monica's nerves were on edge, but she kept her composure. This was it. This was where it all ended. Inside the warehouse, the group of extremists was gathered around a table, discussing their next move. The man in the baseball cap stood at the head of the table, his eyes dark and cold as he outlined the plan. They're going to hit the rally this weekend, one of his men said, voice low. We'll make sure she doesn't make it out alive. The man in the baseball cap smirked. Good. We're going to make sure she pays for everything she's done, for every lie, every speech. It's time for her to feel the pressure. As he spoke, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, his eyes narrowing as he saw the incoming message. It was from Withers. I'm in. Meet me at the warehouse. A smirk tugged at the man's lips. Looks like our friend is coming to play. Monica stood outside the door, her breath coming in quiet gasps as the agents prepared to breach the warehouse. The tension was suffocating. They had to be careful. One misstep, and everything could go wrong. Agent Leonard turned to Monica. You need to stay behind us. If anything goes sideways, we'll get you out. We're prepared for a confrontation, but we're also prepared to move fast if we need to. Monica nodded, her gaze focused. I'm not running away. I'm finishing this. Leonard gave a single nod, and they moved in. The door to the warehouse creaked as the agents opened it. The group inside didn't even seem to notice at first. The agents were swift, taking down any movement in their path. But when they reached the center of the warehouse, they froze. The man in the baseball cap stood at the far end, his arms crossed, with several of his men around him. And there, in the shadows, was Officer Withers. Monica's heart skipped as she saw him, standing there with an almost eerie calm. "Withers," she said, her voice steady despite the shock that roiled inside her. "What are you doing here?" He met her gaze, and for a moment, his expression seemed to flicker with something. Regret, perhaps, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He stepped forward. "This is bigger than you think, Monica," he said, his voice low. "They've made me see things differently. By threatening my life?" Monica shot back, her anger flaring. "By plotting violence? You've gone too far, Withers." He didn't answer, his eyes now scanning the room, as if waiting for something. The man in the baseball cap spoke up, his voice cold and mocking. "You should have stayed out of it, Mrs. Turner. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Monica stood her ground. "I know exactly what I'm doing. And this ends now." Before she could say another word, one of the extremists pulled out a gun, aiming it at her. But in a split second, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the warehouse, and agents stormed in, weapons drawn. The room exploded into chaos. Shots rang out, and in the confusion, Withers made a move. He lunged forward, but Monica was faster. In an instant, she had knocked the weapon from his hand, her instincts kicking in. "Enough!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This ends here." But as the agents took control of the situation, the man in the baseball cap gave a signal. His men scattered, disappearing into the maze of crates and shadows. It was clear that this battle wasn't over, but at least they had taken down the core of the operation. Withers stood in the corner, handcuffed and silent, his eyes a mix of defeat and anger. Monica looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You chose the wrong side," she said quietly, before turning to face the rest of the team. "Take them all in," Leonard ordered. "We're done here." As the agents rounded up the extremists, Monica turned to Richard, who had arrived at the warehouse just in time to see the end of the operation. He rushed toward her, relief flooding his face as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice shaking. "For now," Monica replied, her mind already turning toward the next step. But this is far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She would continue to fight. Because she was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed, for everyone who had been silenced. And she wasn't going to stop until she had won. The following weeks felt like a blur. The extremist group had been dismantled, their leaders arrested, and their operations shut down. Monica had succeeded in her mission, but at a great cost. The threats against her had forced her to live in constant vigilance, to question every decision, and to fear that the next attack could be the one that finally brought her down. But now, as she stood before the press once again, the weight of the last few months hung heavy on her shoulders. This was it. This was the moment to speak, to bring closure to the battle she had fought for so long. Monica stepped up to the podium, her posture strong, her resolve unshakable. The room was packed with reporters, all eyes on her. She had been silent for weeks, and now it was time to speak out. "We have won," she began, her voice calm but filled with the strength that had carried her through the darkness. "We have taken down those who sought to destroy justice. But this is not the end. This is the beginning." The room was silent, save for the clicking of cameras, the scribbling of pens. Monica's gaze swept over the crowd, and she continued. "The violence, the threats, it wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on all of us. On the system we built, on the justice we fought for. And while today we stand victorious, the battle for a fair, just society does not end here." She paused, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her words. "I've seen what happens when we let fear rule us. I've seen what happens when we let hatred spread unchecked. But I've also seen what happens when we stand together, when we fight for what's right. And I will never stop fighting for that." Monica's words echoed in the room, and she knew they were being heard. She wasn't just speaking to the reporters in front of her. She was speaking to every person who had been hurt, silenced, or oppressed. To every person who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter, she had become their voice. "I've been called many things in the past few months," she said, her voice steady. "But the one thing I will always be proud of is this. I will never be silenced, and I will never stop fighting for those who need it most." The applause was thunderous, but it wasn't for her. It was for everyone who had stood beside her. It was for the families who had suffered, for the people who had been hurt by the system, for everyone who believed in justice. As Monica stepped away from the podium, Richard was there waiting for her, his arms open, a smile of relief on his face. "You did it," he whispered, holding her close. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice quiet but full of gratitude. They stood there for a moment, letting the weight of everything they had been through sink in. The fight wasn't over, and they both knew it. There would be more battles to face, more struggles ahead. But for now, they had one. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Monica continued her work, advocating for police reform, for social justice, for a system that truly served all people, not just the privileged few. The reform bill she had worked on for so long passed, and with it came real changes, changes that began to heal the wounds caused by years of injustice. But the work didn't stop there. There was still so much to be done, so many people who needed help, and Monica Turner was ready to give them everything she had. With the weight of the past behind her, she could now look to the future with hope. The battle for justice had just begun, and Monica was leading the charge. As for Officer Withers, his fate had been sealed. His involvement with the extremist group and his betrayal had been exposed, and he was charged with multiple offenses. The law had caught up with him, and he had no one left to turn to. His actions had destroyed his career, his reputation, and his future. But for Monica Turner, the fight had always been about more than just one person. It had always been about the countless voices that had been ignored, silenced, or oppressed, and she had made sure that their voices would never be drowned out again.